at this time. We have a little bit of historical background for those of you that may not know what happened. But, you know, beginning about 1940, the Germans had attacked and they had basically occupied all of France. Obviously, our friends in Europe wanted us to get into World War II, as you can imagine, because Germany had basically taken over Europe. And in the Pacific, the Japanese had started in the 30s and had started moving into a lot of areas of Asia. And they had captured China by this time already, before Pearl Harbor, and they had been moving into Southeast Asia all over the place. And it was probably just a matter of time before the United States was going to be fighting a war on both fronts. You know, something we just kind of held back and we weren't going to do anything overt. Well, the Japanese made our decision for us. And the Japanese moved their carriers into an area where they could send their airplanes off their carriers to Pearl Harbor, which is right in the middle of Honolulu, Hawaii. So the people that are going to be talking to you today were sailors that were on ships that were in this harbor, and I'm going to let them tell the story, and I won't go any further. But obviously, as a result of that, we got into World War II specifically and distinctly, by all means. In an historical perspective, back to the 3 months ago, the day after the Pearl Harbor attack, the Japanese attacked the Philippines in Manila. You remember Lewis, any of you that were here 3 months ago, Lewis Reed, who was a member of the Army division that was stationed in the Philippines, and they attacked them the next day, and that's when our Army troops moved into Bataan, and that's where he was captured as a part of that historical perspective. So these gentlemen are talking about the beginning of the war and their experiences there. Our first speaker is Houston James. He enlisted in 1941, March the 7th. He went to what's called Aviation Metalsmith School at Pensacola. Then he went to a Patrol Squadron in San Diego. He went to Pearl Harbor, October of 41, which means just a couple of months before this attack. He was stationed there which ship was it again? I'm sorry, California, I'm sorry. And then after this attack, he stayed in the Navy and was on the battleship Alabama in Tokyo Harbor at the end of the war. And then he went through the Philippine campaign, Okinawa, Kyushu, and Honshu. Left the Navy in 1946. He received a degree at Rochester Institute of Technology and Graphic Art field. And he is married, 6 children, 7 grandchildren, 1 great-grandchild. And I would like to introduce Houston James for his personal account of what he saw and what he experienced and witnessed at the Pearl Harbor event.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Before I start my speech, I would like to call to your attention this morning that tomorrow morning at 11 o'clock at Laurelland Memorial Park in Oak Cliff area here in Dallas, we have an annual affair for commemorating the attack on Pearl Harbor. And the large monument there, it was erected during World War II, paying honor to 10 people in the Dallas area that lost their lives that day at Pearl Harbor. And we traditionally hold some sort of service there, which is on each December the 7th. So if any of you, it's open to the public, and any of you that would like to attend, we would certainly welcome you and hope you do. Pearl Harbor on this date 58 years ago, as you indicated, I was a member of Patrol Squadron 24. The squadron consists of PBY flying boats. The squadron was based at Naval Air Station, Ford Island, Pearl Harbor. If I may, there is one memory of that day I would like to share with you today. On or about mid-morning, an event occurred that brought the reality of war was all about to this 17-year-old seaman. During the attack, my observations at the time were aircraft scraping, launching torpedoes and bombs, the sight of men swimming in burning oil-coated waters, attempt to escape from sinking ship. My mind would not allow me to think about the death that was occurring around me. One duty I was ordered to perform that morning was to join with a close friend on a specific assignment. We were instructed to proceed to a wooded area in the vicinity of the USS Tennessee, West Virginia. We were told a Japanese aviator was going to be down in that vicinity. During our search of the area, we found him dead. Loading him on the back of the truck we were using, we took him to the dispensary on Fort Island. A naval doctor officially pronounced him dead. We were then told to take a small boat from the boat basin and have a motor wheel boat take his remains to landing sea at the main side of Pearl Harbor. We proceeded in the small craft on our approach to landing sea. We noticed many other small craft like ours awaiting their turn to moor at the landing. A Navy officer with a megaphone noticed our craft and inquired what our mission was. We were advised that we had a dead Japanese aviator aboard. He instructed us to come alongside the dock. Looking down inside the boat from the dock area, he observed the aviator, then in a very stern voice, he told us to deposit that SOB on a nearby knoll away from landing sea. He was emphatic that he did not want him in the area of the dock. We hoisted the Japanese aviator up onto the dock. We then climbed ashore ourselves in order to place him in the appointed area. At that moment, Joe Hughes, my friend, and I saw the utter devastation of war. We also came to understand the dock officer's harsh command. There on the dock were our shipmates, lost in battle that morning. There was silence. They were stacked row on row. The other craft area were patiently waiting to deliver landing sea more for the true heroes of that fateful day. In my advanced years, I've often been confronted by individuals asking if I was allowing my heart to forgive the attackers for the surprise deeds of that December day. I respond by citing my memories of landing sea. I still find it hard to be in a forgiving mood, even today in my twilight years. My tours of duty carried me through various duty stations and ships during World War II. I had the pleasure of being on board Battleship Alabama in Tokyo Bay, September the 2nd, 1945. This is a day we shall always remember. It was on this day the peace treaty was signed, ending that awful war. Thank you for inviting me and my wife, Marion, today, and in observing it, my prayer that we never endure another surprise, Pearl Harbor. Our association motto is Keep America Alert, and thank you.
I notice that Bill Cox, our Associate Director, has joined us. We appreciate your interest and attention to this initiative that we have, Bill. I know, just an editorializing comment, having lost my own legs in Vietnam, it's really hard to forgive the enemy. I saw General MacArthur, a documentary on him the other day, and how he went into Japan after September 2nd when you were there witnessing that event like it was. And, I went back to Pearl Harbor a few years ago, and I went out to Arizona. Just amazing how many people go back to that monument there. It's just a great attraction. In the Missouri, I believe, where the peace treaty was signed, is on permanent display there at Pearl Harbor. And anyone that ever goes back there, it's just a great place to go. It's a great tribute to go and pay your respects to what happened at that event that day. And it's a great part of American military history, a tragic part of American military history. Anytime you go to Hawaii, that is a must-go place over there at Fort Island. Of course, the maps are here for y'all to look at after we're finished. Before I introduce our next speaker, I wanted to mention the fact that we are very grateful here at the hospital for the donation whichever one of you all were involved, perhaps all four of you were involved with the van that you all gave us a couple of years ago. And Mr. Harper and the entire staff here are very grateful, Bob Tanner, for that donation, and it is being put to good use. When you asked about it, I checked on it, and it has been put to very good use, and we're very grateful for the support of the Pearl Harbor Survivors Association giving that to us. Our second speaker today is Roy Holland. He enlisted on active duty in Marshall, Texas in the U.S. Navy, December 7, 1939. He went to boot camp in San Diego. When the attack started, he was on the USS Tennessee, which was just forward of the Arizona, which is the ship that was sunk. He was inboard of the West Virginia. He was in the engineering department in charge of fuel oil stability, and he would close the valves, etc. That was one of his jobs. And there were 1 million gallons of fuel that he was responsible for. His own ship took 2 bomb hits. The West Virginia took 11 torpedoes and sank. There were 5 KIA killed in action on his own ship. He is a 20-year retiree from the Navy, and his civilian career was with the city of Erie, Pennsylvania, an engineer at Pennsylvania State University, the Dallas Independent School District, married with 2 sons and 1 daughter, and 4 grandchildren. May I introduce Roy Holland?
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation to have us for the program. As can readily be seen on the map and the color coding, all those ships, including the gross number in Battleship Road that were sunk on that engagement, are red in color. Those very few who are yellow were not sunk. Ironically, one over in the dry dock, USS Pennsylvania, they couldn't sink her because she was already in dry dock. But they blew up the 2 destroyers that were in dry dock with her. My job, as prefaced in the introduction, I had already admitted, promoted to the second class petty officer. I was responsible in the engineering department. Matter of fact, and further interest, in 20 years, I never fired a gun at anybody after the war started. But I was a machine gunner in a landing force, being trained for that type of work. So I tip my hat and shake the hand of every person who ever wears a Purple Heart. That was justly earned. I say that in context of the questionable ones that I'm aware of exactly one, but we won't dwell on that. We handled casualties from the bomb hit, and particularly the number 3 turret, where armor-piercing bombs went through 6 inches of thick steel, the top layer of the turret, for 14-inch guns, and destroyed the entire gun mount. But they were severely burned, a number, but only we lost 5 casualties in that. Ironically, the bomb that hit the forward part of the ship, in number 2 mount, was exploded. That killed the bridge, including the captain of the West Virginia adjoining, who was berthed outboard of us. The only reason, as was noted, that we couldn't receive any torpedo hits that day was they were making a valiant attempt to do so, but we were about to burn up, and after the Arizona immediately astern blew up with all that fuel oil burning, and the ship was on fire, and then of course that was it. I retired April 1st, 1960, as mentioned, and surprisingly, that's almost 40 years ago. And I'm thankful for being a survivor and other experiences that we continue to share among our organization. I thank you, and I wish everybody a Merry Christmas.
I'd like for a couple of other of our members of the organization, the Pearl Harbor Survivor Association, to be introduced and to stand also. And that's Bob Tanner. Would you stand, Bob? Bob is the, as I recall, the president of the Texas State Chapter of the Pearl Harbor Survivors. Is that correct? Okay, state chairman. And then also J.C. Banks, who is on the USS California. I'd like to welcome them to our audience participation today also. If we ask a question that they can elaborate on, thank you, gentlemen. If we ask a question, someone asks a question they can elaborate on, I'm sure that the other two gentlemen, they all know each other really well, will ask them to be the resource person, and we're glad and delighted to have you here, Mrs. James Beery, and thank you for being our guest today also. I would open it up to questions and answers from them at this point in time. So is that mic live in the middle there, John? Okay, if you would come up to that mic so everyone would be able to hear your question. Do you have any questions you'd like to ask these gentlemen? While we're waiting for someone to come up with one, I'll come up with one and mention a couple of resources. As an Army brat, I was always interested in this. My family lived at Schofield Barracks in the early 60s. Schofield Barracks is where the Army was stationed at on Pearl Harbor, on Hawaii, Oahu, and it's north about 10 or 15 miles from this area. And if you ever want to rent a movie called From Here to Eternity, that's a story that one of the men who had been a veteran of World War II wrote, and it's a movie with Burt Lancaster. Pretty interesting movie, but it shows a lot about the attack. And I believe another movie was called Tora, 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 which was a very interesting movie too. It came out about 20 years ago. And so if you're interested from the historical perspective and looking at the movie version of a lot of what happened on December 7, 1941, both those movies are good resources. And they're kind of rough for young kids, obviously, in some ways, but you as adults would be interested in the historical angle. I'd like to ask you all a question that I've always wondered about. Prior to that Sunday morning, when you all were there any kind of warnings whatsoever? Were you on alert in any way, shape, or form? Okay. You all, let's take each of the four of you if you'd like to answer.
I was going visiting on Sunday morning. I was prepared to go visit a shipmate on the USS Alabama. I could have thrown a baseball over to the ship, but I can't walk on water even yet. I was going to visit a shipmate from Dallas. We had met in town on Friday evening, and he was the ship's tailor. Those old enough to remember the Sharp Oil Company about Dallas, an independent operator, I used to sell that gasoline for the Sharp Oil Company station on Jefferson Avenue for 10 cents a gallon in 1937. But my plans were of thought. I was reading a 5-cent Liberty magazine, seated whenever general quarters sounded. Now that's a general alarm to go to your battle station for all those from Rio Linda or wherever. General quarters sounded on Sunday morning at about 7:45 or thereabout, and I thought somebody hit the wrong switch. Well, it wasn't so. But let me tell you what happened. The bombers, fighters, were already strafing Houston's plane hangars and so forth, destroying the airstrip with bombs and such. And the boatswain on the quarterdeck watch reported to the junior officer of the deck that enemy planes were bombing Ford Island. And he laughed at me. So the boatswain went to the PA system and rang the alarm and announced general quarters. All hands to the battle station. Well, of course, the people up on top side of the battleship on the forward end deck were watching the planes and wondering what's going on, because soon they came down below deck, and I started making motions to get to my battle station, because that's what you've been doing every day for years. Well, as a consequence, about that time the first torpedo hit the West Virginia outboard, and I knew something was up. Little doubt in my mind as to what the consequences were, but not a single word, warning, nothing, not a word.
You have anything to add to that as far as whether you got a warning of any kind, other than when the attack started?
No, well, you know, on our level, we wouldn't probably be aware of what you're asking questions.
Yeah.
There's a general consensus that by some people in our society that swear that Roosevelt knew that that attack was coming down.
It was talking to the mic there, so that's
Okay, that thought Roosevelt was.
Yeah.
And powers being possible. In my heart and heart, I don't agree with that. Having read extensively on the attack because I participated.
Yeah.
History notes that the Japanese did a superb job of fooling us. They had two fleets operating, one that was supposedly the leaking news that they were going into the Indochina area and try to gain oil interests there. And the northern fleet, the Pearl Harbor fleet up north, wasn't even allowed to communicate other than Navy flash. No radio, nothing. They slipped out to sea. And I've had many people confront me and say that Pentagon, there was no Pentagon exactly. The people in the powers in Washington knew what was going on that day. But I would think it would take an awful dumb person to let the fleet, the whole entire Pacific fleet on board, be an anchor in the harbor, and not even at least tell them, if we didn't want to tell them there was attack coming, tell them to have a general drill that morning so the watertight integrity would be in place on all the ships. The devastation of the attack was, there was none of the ships in the harbor that even set watertight integrity, which meant they would have been extremely difficult to see. So I don't believe that there was a true warning.
Bob, would you like to add something to that? Come up to this mic. Tell us your rendition of it. Bob was in the Army Air Corps at Hickam Airfield, which is just to the left. You can see the brown thing, that's the airstrip. It's called Hickam Air Force Base today. You want to point that out? Yeah. And then Ford Island, you want to point that out? That's where Houston was. And then you want to point out where your ship was, Roy? Right? Where's yellow? Where's yellow? Okay.
USS Alabama.
Okay, go ahead.
I was Army Air Corps. We had been on alert for at least 3 weeks before the Pearl Harbor bombing. We came off on Saturday noon, just before that. My birthday happened to be on Friday, so I never got to celebrate my birthday. We came off at Saturday noon, stowed all our gear, all went in supply, everything, and the next morning I was standing on the steps of the barracks. Roy, can you show them where the barracks was? The Holly Mount, Mackay? It's right there. No, right there. That's the hangars. Now the barracks is a little place. I was standing on the steps waiting for 4 of my buddies to come out, 3 of my buddies, because we were going over the other side of the island and have a potty. But we were waiting for the mess hall to close, which closed at 8 o'clock, so we could borrow a GI can and ice and take along our little cooling refreshments like in these days in the spring soda and stuff like that, and have a party. And I heard an airplane, being in the Air Corps, airplane had engines. So I took one step down, I looked up, and I saw a bomb coming right at me. It hit the top of the 3rd floor of that barracks, went through the wall, down through the 2nd floor, 1st floor, blew it, and I'm standing in the door. And in the meantime, the next wing, a a bomb landed in between the two wings. The blast went through that door, missed the other one, it took me about 30 feet out on the lawn. But we had been on alert actually till noon Saturday before everything stopped.
If you have anything you'd like to add, Jason, please come up.
My name is J.C. Banks. I was aboard the USS California. On Friday, before they attacked on the following Sunday week, we were out at sea and fired a night battle practice. And the California also had the admiral in charge of the battle group. After we got through firing on Friday night, he sent the destroyer escort. By the way, we were darkening the ship at that time, but we used running lights. And after the action was over, Admiral Pye sent all the destroyers back into Pearl. They could go in, anytime they wanted to because it was draw very little bit of draft. So about 1 o'clock in the morning, according to the lookouts, they could see the destroyers coming back over the horizon with the running lights, you see. But when we went in board on Saturday morning, before, we'd always send all the ammunition below into the magazines. At this particular time, we kept up 2 radio boxes on the aircraft deck and sail loft, made canvas to droop over these radio boxes, and gunner's mate and the striker would keep them wet down, to keep the ammunition stabilized all through the next week. Well, that kind of hit its nerve at that time, but we soon forgot that. Well, soon thereafter, Sunday morning I was compartment king. I'd just been transferred to the engineering department 2 months prior, and I was going to the top side. Got a picture of the California that has a canvas over the top, and it's rigging for church. Well, I was, before my duty began, was leaving the department. Well, I was going top side to watch them rig for church. Well, as I started to hit the ladder, General Porter sounded. Now, I don't know why we sounded General Porter, because we had no other, there's nothing to indicate that. But I went from forward almost to the forecastle deck, which is almost forward, all the way forward. And incidentally, about longer than 2 football fields. But my station was almost half. Along the way down there, while we was driving about having to go to General Quarters on Sunday morning. Well, about the time I got to my battle station, we called a torpedo. And I thought, having fired in the number 3 turret several times, I thought it seemed extremely strange that they'd fire while sitting in port. Well, I knew they wouldn't. And then about that time, the announcer was put the address system said we just taken a torpedo from the Japanese. We got the second torpedo and we lost the load, the power for the generator and so forth. And, I guess I better stop here and tell the story later. When we lost the load, that means that we had no power for the ammunition hoist. Getting a little bit hairy, but to pass the word, we had auxiliary lights but wasn't hooked up with the power. To pass the word from people to sail midship, which would have double ladders midship, to pass ammunition up to the magazine, way down deep in the ship to pass it all the way up to the gun deck to the aircraft battery. Well, they got up there, was passing, the way they passed ammunition, this was fixed ammunition. I don't know, a lot of the guys that may have been in the service, but the 5-inch shells were fixed. It wasn't semi-fixed ammunition. But they passed from this guy to me with 2 ladders, mind you. And we called the bomb right between this ammunition passage. I was one of the people who take those people off the ship, so pretty rare, as I say. I believe I'll stop with that.
Does anyone else come up with a question? Yes, you're going to come up to the mic, please.
I couldn't help but to notice, in the conversation that you guys were having, just a minute ago, one of the gentlemen was in the Air Force, and the other gentleman was basically, a lot of you were in the Navy. And from what I'm listening to your conversations that went on during the attack time, that you never had any kind of radio contact to be able to even inform your stations that you were in a war situation. Is that not so? And then I was listening to this other gentleman that was up there just a few minutes ago talking about the way they had to transport the bombs from one man to another, that really you didn't have enough manpower to be able to move the bombs to where you needed to load up at for you to even help yourselves in getting away from to be able to help yourself during battle. You couldn't work the machines because the manpower wasn't fast enough to get it into the whatever they used at that time.
Yeah, let me help elaborate on what I think you're asking. Okay, is that all you wanted to mention?
Yeah.
Okay, but I think a couple of things. Number one, obviously once the attack started, there wasn't any special necessity, I presume, to communicate between the Arizona and California. You just had to go to battle stations and start returning fire. Is that accurate as far as answering number one? Fairly accurate. Number two, you had your deck guns that were for bombardment. So when you're talking about these shells, would they have been able to have the profile to be able to shoot down planes? You talk about the shells that you were working on. You talk about machine guns. Oh, they were anti-aircraft. Okay, so they were trying to get anti-aircraft shells into the guns to shoot them down, but they also worked their machine guns and deck guns. Is that correct? Anybody like to elaborate on that as far as the return fire?
The 5-inch 25 caliber anti-aircraft weapons, all of the weapons required electrical power and compressed air for operation. And when the ship's system failed, as was illustrated, and of course the USS West Virginia never fired one gun, because immediately the first torpedoes that hit the West Virginia outboard to the port side of her were into the auxiliary boiler room, and immediate loss of power and light. That was the end result. And all the ships that were sunk suffered more or less the same consequence.
Ironically, to show you the devastation of what we're talking about on a torpedo attack by the Japanese, the Oklahoma was hit and was completely upside down in the water for 7 minutes. She took us, I think it was either 7 or 8 torpedoes and capsized completely in 7 minutes.
So you would make
Come on up here.
Tennessee and the California were sister ships. They're both turboelectric. In other words, we generated electricity and was driven by big motors. And we didn't have, I don't know for Tennessee, we didn't have auxiliary boiler room, but it was all one combination. We kept boilers lighted off to generate electricity to run all parts of the ship, and that was part of the system. But the whole system went out. And that's the reason we had to have this ammunition train where we got the bomb blades, because the whole system had gone out electric-wise.
Yeah. Now those, the other part of the question was, were you missing people as far as the passing the ammunition? You had enough people to pass the ammunition if you could. Yeah, so they had enough people. They came to the gun deck area.
okay, with the power being out, they were considered what they call that old-fashioned thing, you were just sitting there and just be.
Yeah, well, if the power was out and the guns couldn't work, there was nothing they could do. Would your machine guns still work on the deck without the power system? They still had the machine guns they could use. Yeah.
30 or 50 caliber.
Huh? Yeah, they can still operate to 5 inches. They said. Any other questions? Yes.
Let me say thank you for coming and sharing with us, gentlemen. It means a lot to those of us who've never experienced such
the station.
I was wondering from a female perspective, perhaps from someone back home who was waiting to hear from you. I wonder how long before you were able to get in touch with your families and let them know what happened to you specifically, or did they just have to read a list and hope your name was not on it?
I'd like to answer that because it's kind of an ironic thing. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States government did not want the Japanese to know how much damage they'd done to the fleet in Pearl Harbor. So we were not allowed in any shape, form, or manner to write or communicate with anybody in the United States. The first thing that anybody probably here that was there that day can remember, they gave us what was called back in those days a penny postcard. It was typewritten message on it that said, I am Houston James and I am sick or have been wounded or I'm well, and that's all you couldn't even write it. You had to check it and then sign your name, and then they took and collected all of those and flew them to the United States on an airplane. And my family, my mother received mine, I think it was 18 days after the attack. I don't know if you remember.
My support of that endeavor, the cards that we were given, and we could sign them and check off, just as Houston mentioned. Ironically, December 7th was my mother and father's wedding anniversary, and the attack came on that day. I had left Marshall, Texas, being called to enlist on December 7th. So, but my mother told me later, whenever we finally got out of Pearl Harbor, 10 days later, after they moved enough material out of the way that we could get out from behind the barrier, Oklahoma against the Maryland, and ahead of us, that we could get out and discharge all of the burned and water-drenched ammunition in the main magazines at the Navy Yard. But my mother received that postcard on Christmas Eve day. And she said that was the finest Christmas present she'd ever received. Thank you.
Peter, you want to add?
I got the card, but I never signed it or wrote it because I had nobody. My mother had died all the time. I was in Hawaii. I didn't have enough money to go home to the world. And I didn't get back to States until 1942. I went over in 1938 and back.
Any other questions? Yes.
Let's set the camera real quick.
I got two-part question. I'm retired Air Force and studied a little military history. One, is it true the Japanese ambassador was in Washington when Pearl Harbor was attacked? Second, what did we learn from this? And I'm talking appeasement, of course, being prepared military.
What's the second question, John?
Second question is, what did we learn from Pearl Harbor that we should take and be ready?
Well, all of you gentlemen, are survivors of that day. You were, regular people in our military, young men at that time, and most of you, it appears, were in for the duration of the war. So at this age, 50, 60 years after all of this, what are your thoughts about the lessons learned, and what's the lessons for America?
My lessons was learned.
One at a time. Let's go with Roy first.
My lesson was learned long before. There wasn't even a conscription act to draft me in the military. I knew where I wanted to be. I didn't want to go work for Adolf Hitler. And consequently, they increased the enlistment period from 4 to 6 years on July 1st, 1939. But that didn't deter me. I still wanted to be where I was. The end result is, and if you obviously are all interested in the history, if I could suggest to you, please read a book published by John Toland, author. The title is Infamy, and you can buy it for under $10, a paperback copy, and make your own decision as to whether or not, after due research, many years of waiting for the files to be opened, and make up your own mind. It's rather revealing it was to me. Thank you.
I think one of the things that is part of our organization's motto is one that I subscribe to, and that is keep America alert. And I really mean that in my heart, that the politicians that have to allot the money to build carriers and aircraft and that type of thing need to be completely aware of what's going on in the world and be prepared to take care of anything that needs to be taken care of. And if I had anything to say about what happened in fighting one of these conflicts that we've been through or maybe some future time go through, I would like to see it be treated like the World War II, and that's get in and get the hell beat out of them and get out of it, and not stop in halfway into the thing like they did in Vietnam. I have a son that got some Purple Hearts in Vietnam, and my heart was broken to this day over it. And I swear they shouldn't have stopped when they did. And they shouldn't have tied their hands, and I believe that. And I say, let's don't do that anymore.
I'll vote for a lot of that. Robert, would you like to add anything? Come on up here if you would.
You know, history goes back quite a ways. You had never heard that there was a first attack on Pearl Harbor in 1934. And it was an exact replica of a practice of what happened in December 7, 1941. The Japanese brought their fleet in and inundated the island completely. It's quite a story. I was surprised when I read it, but it's true. And what we didn't learn from that first attack, that we were that vulnerable. Everybody thought Hawaii is sitting out in the middle of that nice little pearly ocean out there. Nobody could touch it. They found out that they were very, very wrong. And in the first place, when the Japanese ambassador was in Washington negotiating for a peaceful settlement of our problems, which was one was trade and steel and junk metals and all of this, which we found later on by bottle caps from Knickerbocker beer, that they put in the bombs and threw them at us. Black all over the place. We used to go pick them up. That's what they were negotiating for, to get and oil. They stopped shipping oil to Japan, furnishing with oil. They have no oil source of their own. That's what started the whole thing. But everybody was sitting back there, well, they could never get to Hawaii without us knowing it. The funny part about it is, instead of coming in from the south or the northwest like they said, they come in from the northeast. In other words, they went near to the States, come back at us. So nobody ever thought that we would ever get hit. And I think we learned that in the book that Roy talked about. I think it's one of the best portrayals of the build-up to it and the aftermath of it and what could be learned from it. It's an excellent book.
Casey, anything to add?
However, was related to what Bob was just saying, when Amelia Earhart went down, you know the story, the fleet was out looking for her. When they came back into Pearl, they made this maneuver that the Japanese followed, and Admiral Richardson was commander of the Pacific Fleet. And he was rather outspoken about this, to the extent that they relieved him and sent Admiral Kimball out there. We know the results of what happened to Kimball, and it wasn't Kimball's fault. I don't believe then or today that it was Kimball and Short's fault. I think it was IRS. But speaking of being prepared, it's like every Sunday you go service the Lord. I think we should be prepared, and I think our fleet and our whole system should be well out to take care of the United States. And I do believe the United States. Thank you, sir.
I think I'll just ask for one more comment quickly from one or two of you at most. Is number one, I've always had the impression that the majority of the casualties from the Arizona are still entombed in the ship. Is that accurate?
Over 1,170 are still there.
Okay. And how far below the surface actually is the Arizona, the bulk of it?
Parts of her barbettes, which is the heavy steel encasement around each of the main battery guns,
Yeah.
are almost above water level. They can be seen from the deck, the area of the memorial.
Memorial, right, okay. Now, when was the first time that some ship that had been hit was able to be repaired enough to steam out of the harbor?
We were immediately ahead of the Arizona. The Maryland was immediately ahead of us behind the Oklahoma, West Virginia. We were squeezed in so tightly by the ship sinking as to require a pile driver to destroy the reinforced concrete piers that the ships moored to. That took 10 days before we could even move out. And of course, I'm not sure about the Pennsylvania when she was able to get out, but after the attack, we steamed out of there at flank speed 10 days later, and we were steaming west with a convoy for 3 days. We didn't know where we were going, but we were certainly not in battle condition because of the loss of ammunition in the main turret. Only one of the 4 main batteries was operable. All the others. And we were turned about and sent to the coast, the west coast for repairs.
Yes, some of the destroyers anchored out in the channel were able to get underway. It was a matter of getting the boilers fired up. So there was a good many destroyers. In fact, one of our associates was aboard one of those destroyers and got underway that day. But they sorted and went out to sea with I think they were looking for the Japanese fleet, but they were hoping they wouldn't find it. Because they would have probably done it in trying to fight battleships and aircraft carriers with destroyers.
We're going to close here, but I'd like Bob and JC to both come and stand with these other 2 gentlemen. I'd like the 4 of you to stand before your audience. We want to thank you all very much for your time and your coming over here and sharing these experiences with us. Obviously, the VA North Texas healthcare system is a place that cares about our vets. We care for our vets 24/7, and we care about our vets who are our veterans, and some of you, I presume, are patients, or maybe hopefully all of you, if you ever need care, will get it from us, because we're open to everyone. And we're very proud of your service to our country, because we care about the history, the living history of the people like you who have served our nation so valiantly. We really appreciate you all very much, and we'd like to extend our final thanks to you for coming and acknowledge your presence.